My name is Delaney Swann. I am covering punk fashion and punk rock, and this is Anarchy in the UK by the Sex Pistols. Punk rock is a music and fashion movement that started in the 1970s that emphasized fast music that lacked technical skill and fashion that made use of clothing connected to sexual fetishes like BDSM and gender nonconformity, and emphasized a do-it-yourself approach to clothing. Punk was a counterculture movement that lacked emphasis of intellectualism that you see in movements such as the Beats or the hippies, and most punks came from working families and were expected to take working class jobs, but rejected those expectations in order to live in ways they found more enjoyable, which typically meant doing things like drugs, listening to hard, fast rock and roll, and having sex. Punk has evolved, but still exists in a very similar form to the movement that occurred during the 1970s, and the movement has had a noticeable impact on mainstream fashion today. So in my research, I've used several theoretical lenses in order to understand the punk movement. Carolyn White's theory of personal adornment tells us that there is information to be gathered from the clothing, jewelry, and makeup that people wore, as well as the historical context they wore it in. Gender bending is a style of personal adornment that rejects the expectations for your sexual and gender identity. Jane B. Singer describes ethnography as understanding people's stories as gathered through interviews and other journalistic means within the context of their culture. And Judith Butler's theory of gender and performance says that your gender is a series of acts that you perform every day in order to feel and assign yourself to these gender norms. I also use mainstream in this presentation to mean societal norms that are set by the upper and middle class and are pretty much what's most popular at that time. So I've used this emphasis on understanding culture and context in order to describe the gender and societal norms of the 1970s and the culture in which the punk rock started so that we can understand why punk rock artists chose the clothing and personal adornment that became symbolic of the movement. Because punk rock was an underground movement, I felt that understanding the motivations and stories of individual punks would lead me to better understand than a more academic kind of study. So I sought out the oral history of major punk rock artists and the people that were around them when punk was created. I also tried to relate their stories to people on local scenes who were notably dedicated to the punk movement in some way. Finally, I took the concepts and stories of the people I interviewed and analyzed images from the 1970s punk movement in order to understand how Outlook impacted dress. And so through a careful analysis of the philosophy and personal adornment of punk artists in the 1970s, we can better understand how and why punk bears such a great influence on modern mainstream fashion. So one of the best explanations of how punk was created and why came from one of these oral histories. Here, Ed Sanders, who was a poet that watched both the hippie and punk movements begin, says, "So there developed another kind of lumpen hippie, one who came from an abused childhood, from parents that hated them, from parents that threw them out. Maybe they came from a religious family that would call them sluts or say you had an abortion, get out of here, or I found your birth control pills in your purse, get out of here, go away. And those kids fermented into a kind of hostile street person, punk types." And this was written in the oral history, Please Kill Me. So I took this to mean that most punks came to this art form and community because of a feeling of being rejected by traditional values held by working class people. And I found this to be mostly true. So Derek Bean was a punk rock singer and promoter on the St. Louis scene during the 1980s and 90s. I interviewed Derek Bean because he has been involved in punk rock for decades and has a similar background to many of the punk rock artists that I used as case studies for analysis. So Derek Bean came from a working class family, which he noted that he had a somewhat dysfunctional structure. He didn't attend college and avoided taking a traditional industrial job and instead started promoting punk rock shows, waiting tables, and eventually became the brewer. And I know Derek Bean because my parents waited tables with him in St. Louis during the 90s. In our interview, he noted that during the 1980s, he experienced violence between different cliques and people claiming diverging identities. He was attracted to punk because of the anger the music offered and a community of people who had similar backgrounds and family situations. Specifically, he said, what me and most of my friends had in common was that all of our fathers were alcoholics. Melanie Bernier is another punk rock artist who has been really active in the Boston scene and who I found because of art pieces she made memorializing the underground punk movement here that was shut down several years ago. Melanie has been in several punk rock bands in the past 7 years, and to her, punk has always been a way to create community around self-expression through art and fashion. And although Melanie is a whole decade younger than Derek, she also noted that her home was dysfunctional and she rebelled against the very traditional views that her parents held her and her 7 siblings to. She said that punk provided an alternative community to what her parents offered, and she appreciated the acceptance that she found in this community. So the experiences I collected through my interviews and research demonstrated a departure from the mainstream. So what was the mainstream was when punk was created. In the 1970s, we see that mainstream youth culture had kind of adopted the hippie counterculture of the 1960s, but with a serious emphasis on women still maintaining a very feminine and effortless way, feminine way of dressing and having this very natural and effortless beauty. So during the 1970s, men are still perceived as being the head of the household, and while women are likely to have more freedom for self-expression, it's still expected that they will adhere to these beauty standards and quietly take their place in the home once they marry. And in terms of styles, we see that bright colors and bell-bottoms are very much the norm. So punk emerges as a form of music in rebellion of the expectations the working class has for these people that don't want to quietly adhere to these standards. And Wayne Kramer, who's the lead singer of MC5, explains this by saying, "We knew the world generally sucked, and we didn't want to be a part of it. We wanted to do something else, which amounts to not wanting to get up in the morning and have a real job. So our political program became dope, rock and roll, and fucking in the streets." This really exhibits how punk is not a political, artistic movement. It's more of just rebellion from society in general. So here we see 3 people who exist in this intersection of punk music and fashion. On the left, we see Iggy Pop, the lead singer of the Stooges, performing at Max's in Kansas City. Iggy Pop's clothing really rejects this square and natural expectation for dress by using a lot of leather and buckles, which is associated with a sexual fetish. He's also wearing thigh-high leather boots in this picture, although you can't really tell because he's kind of standing on people, which goes with the theme of BDSM and is a gender-bending choice because thigh-high boots are typically a woman's choice in footwear. The center picture is of Blondie, who is an icon of the early punk movement. Her studded leather belt and leather glove is representative of the BDSM clothing that most punks were wearing at this time. Blondie is also known for being extremely beautiful, but she doesn't really adhere to this very natural, effortless beauty because she's wearing, you can't super tell, but she always wears this very intense eyeliner, and she had bleached blonde hair, which was not seen at this time. Finally, the right picture shows punk poet and artist Patti Smith. She is on the left. The other person is a man. She's known for a more androgynous look, and she's a real proponent of gender bending through fashion because she has this kind of masculine hairstyle. And she's wearing straight jeans in this picture, which is not the norm at this time because you only see people wearing bell-bottoms. Even the guy in this picture is wearing bell-bottoms. And so you can really see how punk fashion impacted mainstream fashion because you would not have seen people wearing ripped jeans at that point, but almost lots of you in this room are wearing ripped jeans today. And we would even call this style of pants that she's wearing, we would call it boyfriend because it's straight leg and it doesn't exactly fit her. So after the introduction of punk as a movement, tangible audience involvement in the promotion of punk quickly becomes the norm. This is done through fanzines, which are short, cheaply made pamphlets with lyrics from punk songs and pictures of bands. And so here are two of those fanzines displaying images that creators thought truly represented the punk movement. In the picture on the right, we see punk actress Cherry Vanilla. Her personal adornment speaks to both a disregard for mainstream beauty standards as well as societal norms. She is wearing such intense makeup that I couldn't tell if she was a woman or a man in drag. She's also wearing a very sexually aggressive message on her clothing, like me, in case you can't really tell, which displays a level of forwardness that wasn't societally endorsed for women at this point. And on the left is UK punk icon Sue Catwoman, who gave herself this name after her hairstyle, which is shaped into cat ears. She also is wearing very dark and intense eyeliner, and it's not really used in a way to like show off her eye shape or anything like that. She's wearing it because she wants to say like fuck you to beauty standards. And she's also wearing chains and skulls on her jewelry, which is a part of the BDSM influence that punks adopted and really took to a new level in the United Kingdom. So the intensity of the fashion in the United Kingdom was largely due to the influence of Vivienne Westwood and her husband Malcolm McLaurin. Vivienne Westwood is pictured on the right, wearing the tartan fabric that is largely associated with punk fashion and which we see women wearing even today in like the high-waisted pants. And you can see her friend has brightly dyed hair, which was another part of like the UK punk movement. So artists in the United Kingdom were largely responsible for bringing punk to mainstream consciousness in 1977 because of the popularity and controversy surrounding bands like the Sex Pistols. And so Johnny Rotten is the lead singer of the Sex Pistols. He's pictured center, and he's displaying safety pin fashion, which was adopted because Sid Vicious wore safety pins, and he's pictured on the right, during one of their shows, because frankly he didn't want to fix his clothing and was kind of like fixing it in like the best way that he knew how. And Sid Vicious is on the right, as I just said, and he's wearing a leather jacket, straight like ripped jeans, and dirty Converse, which is also a look that lots of people adopt later. So where are we now? After the explosion of punk in the United Kingdom, smaller movements across the United States and the world took hold. Punk is one of the most accessible countercultural movements because it doesn't have an intellectual barrier, and because of this accessibility, punk becomes a symbol of the alternative, to the mainstream or traditional. Punk music and punk scenes still exist and are still protecting people that are rejected by mainstream society, like people identifying as queer and trans, and people whose stories look a lot like the Ed Sanders quote, like Derek Bean and Melanie Bernier, and people like the lead singer of the modern punk band Gloss, Sadie Switchblade, who's pictured on the right. Left. As punk moved from relatively unknown to a mainstay of fashion choices, that started to be reflected in mainstream fashion and realtors. Lua, who's a fashion blogger from the picture in the middle, is popular and successful because of her use of punk clothing, hair, and makeup. And so this popularity leads to profitability, and now we see items like this leather dress with safety pins as clasps in upscale retailers sold at prices that like real punk rockers can't afford, and it's completely devoid of the intense personal rebellion or meaning punks gave to their clothing. And this is really where I bring my point home, which is like if you want to adopt a way of dressing, it's really important that you understand the meaning and the cultural significance behind it. And I wouldn't necessarily call this cultural appropriation, but like that is the idea behind cultural appropriation. So in my future research, I'd really like to look into the next 2 decades of punk movements, which were hardcore, emo, and riot girl. And I'd like to acknowledge Melanie Bernier and Derek Bean for letting me interview them, as well as my father for introducing me to punk in my childhood. And here's my works cited.